All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. I know I'm going to be sensitive to all of your time today. I think my goal is to try to usually keep these conversations to about 30 minutes or so. Ultimately, my goal is to try to say really focus on really six topics today. But within there, try to overwhelm you with as many best practices and insights and emerging trends that I possibly can. With or without Reviewr, my goal is that there's at least one small takeaway that you can take and apply to your programs overnight. I know we have a wide audience here today. A lot of you guys are doing scholarships, a lot are doing grants, board nominations, fellowships, donor sponsor requests. The concepts that we're going to chat about actually are very similar across all different use cases. Obviously, how you execute them will look a little bit differently, but kind of keep an open mind. So, with all that said, let's go and get the ball started. My name is Kyle. I'm the CEO here at Reviewr. Been doing this really since we started the company back in about 2012. I think that's a really quick or important quick little note to offer is that Reviewr kind of comes from the same space as you guys. So long story short, back in about 2012, we served from a pure volunteer capacity on review committees, right? So we're the ones who had to go through the spreadsheets, go through the emails. We had physical binders mailed to our doorstep. We lived that life, right? And so when kind of talk about some of the operational burdens and challenges that go into these programs, it's not, lost on deaf ears, right? Like we really have lived this life. And we built Reviewr for kind of two main purposes. One is how do we operationally make your admin life substantially easier, right? Letting you focus more on like your daily obligations and providing more impact to your mission and vision, less so getting bogged down in spreadsheets and downloading documents. But more importantly, is how do we elevate the experience? And that key term there is the experience for applicants, your staff, the review committees, the volunteers, your donors, your sponsors, your endowments, and really everybody that makes the program go. The goal here obviously is not to go from submission to decision. That's obviously what Reviewr helps you do. It's to help you go from submission through decision, giving you guys the data and the proper workflows and sequences to measure program ROI, right? How do we make sure that we can report back to our team and to our donors and to our sponsors that, with this program that we ran for the last year, here's how many people were awarded, here's how much money we awarded them for, here's a breakdown of them, and then more specifically, how do we actually measure the impact that we had on their lives? And so that's really at its core premise why Reviewr exists. Now, the platform in itself will take you guys from the full life cycle from submission through post decision. So the reason why I kind of gave you that is we're very fortunate to work with thousands of organizations doing a wide variety of use cases. And so what we're able to do is kind of stay at the forefront and hear from people like yourselves what's actually impacting you guys on a daily basis. What are some of the emerging trends? What are some of the best practices? What are some of the new technologies and workflows that you're starting to face? And then we can kind of leverage that to not just enhance the platform, but also to host webinars like this and offer some of those insights. So today I want to talk about six kind of major things that we're starting to see within the space. In full transparency, not all of them are emerging trends. There are six things that we highly emphasize with our clients that we know from a thousand plus other scholarships that by doing this, the programs will be elevated to the next level. So they're not all emerging best practices and trends. It's more so what we think, right, you guys should be doing. So with that said, let's quickly run through what those six items are, and then I'm going to practically visually show you guys how to power this in Reviewr. Again, the goal here obviously is not to demo the system. If you guys want to learn more about the platform, I did drop in a link to my chat if you guys want to schedule a more one-on-one. But I think, again, helping you guys visualize how to actually execute this should translate into however you guys are going to do this, maybe without Reviewr. Ideally, you work with us. So the first thing we're going to look at is the matching process, right? So for many of you guys, there's kind of a two-part process that comes into play. Your scholarships, your grants has formal eligibility, right, criteria and requirements. It could be GPA ranges, it could be locations. There's a certain demographic that you're trying to serve. And so the goal here is how do we not waste an applicant's time applying to opportunities that they're not eligible for, nor waste your team's time vetting through a bunch of ineligible submissions. What I want to focus on, though, is how do we go a step further, specifically speaking for the larger programs that might offer multiple scholarships or multiple grants. How do we actually leverage what we know about a candidate and actually map them and align them and kind of guide them to the appropriate opportunity to make sure that they're going to the right spot? The second thing we're going to look at kind of at the same time is how do we properly manage references? This is certainly an emerging trend. We've seen a major shift in the industry moving away from a very traditional letter format, specifically uploaded by the applicants themselves, and instead moving more towards a template model that lowers the barrier for the references and creates a much more equal playing field for your staff as you're doing the review. The third thing we're going to look at is probably the most insightful conversation today, which is how to avoid things like volunteer fatigue and review bias. At the end of the day, we have limited time. We've looked really closely at the data at Reviewr to suggest that if a certain number of submissions is being reviewed by a staff member, there is a law of diminishing return. Not only are they spending more time that they have, but it actually has a direct impact on those applicants themselves. So, for example, if you're reviewing 30, 40, 50, 60 submissions, the last 30, even though you're using a scorecard, they're being scored on a completely different scale than the first 10 that you looked at. Also, the order in which that they're getting reviewed has a direct impact on those scores. So it's not just, how do we lower fatigue? It's what happens when fatigue sets in and how does it negatively impact both the scholars and the overarching results. How do we address that? Obviously, some efficiency tools, but also the next bullet point here, which is AI assisted review. Polarizing conversation. By no means do we want to remove the human element to these programs, but there are practical ways that AI could be leveraged to at least reduce the time on task from the review team. And I'm talking if we can shave off, 2 to 3 minutes left and right, that incrementally compounds to save your team and your volunteers hours of legwork. The last couple things we're going to look at is score normalization. This one hits home to me. With a lot of the processes at Reviewr, we've heard from clients that the review teams and committees don't score on the same scale. And what I mean by that, like as Kyle, might score way higher or lower than Jessica. And so as an applicant, if you were assigned to me, you're at an immediate disadvantage because I'm going to score way lower than maybe he or she would. And so, how do we start to identify the individual judging tendencies of your staff and actually take that into consideration when you're generating the results to make sure that we're not rewarding or penalizing applicants based off of the straw that they were drawn of who they were assigned to. And then the last thing we're going to look at is proper post-selection workflows, closing the loop, collecting things like acceptance packets, fund disbursement forms, information from the candidates, but then also long-term, how do we start to collect things like testimonials and impact reports that you can then leverage to prove ROI of your program. So with all that said, let's jump into the first bullet point here. I do like to always start with like a TLDR, too lazy, didn't read. If there's kind of one slide to walk away from, I already kind of addressed it, but the idea is not to have, a bunch of separate application forms that are fillable PDFs or online forms that are one dimensional, right? We want to have logic that's built in that tracks eligibility. It's very custom and catered to the specific scholarship that they're going to be applying for. And then leveraging automation to kind of route that to the appropriate team. Number two is let's ditch the concept of a reference letter. Instead, let's collect references directly from the source, not from the applicants, and let's move more towards a template model. Overarching, I'm going to kind of throw out a number here. On average, most of your review teams should not be looking at more than 30 or 40 submissions. Their energy and fatigue starts to set in. We also know for a fact that each applicant should be reviewed between 3 to 5 times. So let's go ahead and jump into these. You guys can obviously read my screen. And like I said, we will be sharing a recap of this. So my goal is not to kind of get too bogged down in PowerPoint presentations. I want to show you how to practically do this. So we'll be sharing here probably end of day today or tomorrow morning a recap to everything that we're going to talk about. So with all that said, first bullet point here, which is your eligibility check and your matching. So the general premise behind this is that no matter what program that you're offering, there's likely some type of requirements. They could be quite simple or they could be quite robust. The idea though is how do we leverage a persona, right? Collecting information from the candidate very early on to even identify are they eligible to proceed on or not. Again, if not, let's not waste their time nor your team's time. As you guys also know, if you are a larger program and you have quite a few different scholarships or quite a few different grants, applicants don't read, right? And so you might also find that certain programs are going underfunded or under applied for. And so the idea is how do we actually help the applicants be aware of what opportunities exist and specifically which ones that they're most qualified for. And so the idea is not just, to say, hey, you're eligible, yes or no. It's, hey, not only are you eligible, but of this portfolio of programs that we offer, these are the three that we actually think you best align with. Now, of those 30, which of or all of them do you want to apply for? So it's guiding them through the process, it's making recommendations, and then from there, we want to lower the barrier, right? So if you're applying to three different kind of scholarships, right, from your organization, don't make them redundantly re-enter who they are each and every time, right? We already know what that information is. Let's preload that. And if we want to, we can start to ask very custom questions on a scholarship by scholarship basis. So again, I want to, again, visualize this for you. So if I jump into Reviewr here, this entire kind of concept and everything we're going to look at here today is powered by a concept called profiles. It really is the bread and butter that you guys have to be deploying across all of your different programs. we got to shift away from like the very one-dimensional, here's an online form, or here's a form in general. It could be a PDF form, it could be email back in, it could be a job form, it could be your AMS. We have to move away from that model. There are so many moving parts that go into scholarships. You've got people and their content. Their content is, their form fields, their file uploads, their references, their resumes, whatever deliverables that you're collecting from them. And then on top of that, you've got communication back and forth. You've got the actual review scoring selection process. And then ideally, you've got the ongoing impact report and deliverables from those that are being collected. And so, as you can imagine, if you have online forms or if you're having applicants email in their applications, that's just like 1/8 of the overarching puzzle. What we really want to have happen here is applicants come in, they create their profile, which long term holds on to all the activities and all the information relevant to them, which then does two things. It unlocks the ability for you guys to kind of keep everything in one spot, but also unlocks the review and selection engine that we're going to come into here in a little bit. So applicants come in, they kind of tell us who they are, and then it drops us into what I was talking about, which is the eligibility check. And so again, this is completely configurable by all of our clients per program. Each one of you has different requirements. Some are quite simple. Do you have a certain GPA range? Are you from the city of Lincoln, Nebraska? Are you going to be pursuing a certain career path? Some are far more robust, right? And so the idea is first and foremost collecting basic information about the candidate. And then in this example, we did keep it really simple for today's conversation. It's a series of yeses and nos. Are you a graduating high school senior? Do you have a GPA of a 2.5 or higher? Are you participating in high school athletics? All the questions here map directly to not only your eligibility, but across your portfolio of programs. What is each program's requirements? Once we have an applicant fill this out, we now have behind the scenes a persona about them. So at its bare minimum, we can say, hey, unfortunately, this scholarship is only open to those who are, attending the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. We see that you're applying from Iowa. So in that example, you cannot proceed. We didn't waste their team's time. We didn't waste your time as well. The other interesting piece to this is that you might start to identify that there's a bulk of applicants who are attempting to apply that are not eligible, and that's okay. At least now you have the insights and the data around why that is. And who knows, that might be valuable information for you to go back to donors and to sponsors and say, hey, look, of the scholarships that we offer, we had this many people who were ineligible. We want to spin up a new opportunity to serve that underserved demographic. And again, helping prove the ROI to that donor that money should be going to those people. So it's not just tracking eligibility, it's also giving you kind of like a future growth plan of additional opportunities that you want to be providing to them. Now, in this example, we actually offer probably 15 to 20 different scholarships. And so we take the information that's learned from here, and then the system can then cross-reference it against all of your programs and say, hey, look, of the 15 to 20 scholarships that we offer, these are the three that you're actually eligible for. Now, of these three, which of or all of them do you want to apply for? So again, we're guiding the applicant through the process. In a perfect environment, this applicant coming in was applying to the Lennox Wilder Scholarship. They had no idea that they even were eligible for the Brooke Marlowe. Now that they are aware of it, they apply for it and they're selected. That'd be like the best case example of this working. The idea, though, is if I choose, say, for example, both the Jasper Rye and the Brooke Marlowe Scholarship, the system can then update. And on the back, and I'm going to show this to you, it's going to do two things. It's going to categorize them, right? So now we have a bucket or a grouping of all the Brooke Marlowe applicants and one of all the Jasper Rye applicants. And the system's going to say, okay, let's collect information about you, who you are, your first name, your last name, your parents' information, whatever that is. And then we're going to start to layer on the scholarship specific questions, right? So if you've got a certain donor that wants a very particular essay, right, the system then knows, hey, this belongs to this scholarship. Therefore, let's display this question. So as an applicant applies to multiple scholarships, the system then preloads their profile with their first name, last name, and email because it's redundant, but we're still asking them to fill out the very specific questions on a program by program basis. So I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds of like the applications. Again, that's not today's conversation. With all that said, I think that it really is important for you guys to build applications that match the mission and vision of your organization. We see a lot of organizations that are very essay driven, a lot of them that are very financial need driven. Personally, I like a combination of three things. I like to get academic achievements. I like to get financial need information, and then I like to get personal storytelling, which is the number one driver to help applicants differentiate themselves from their peers in a very competitive application space. So I am going to come back to this here in just a couple seconds. At any point, if you guys have any questions or comments, please do toss them in the chat, and then we'll come back to those here at the end for a Q&A. It's also critical at this point too for you guys to be able to have applicants save, log out, come back later. 71% of scholars wait until the week of a deadline to apply. We're going to assume that they're not completely procrastinating. They're working offline, they're collecting their deliverables. And so life happens, people wait, they miss deadlines. And so in this example, since they can start, save, log out, come back later, we give you guys that visibility. And so you can kind of track in real time who's done, who's not done. You can automate reminders, etc. So before I kind of go deeper into this, I do want to kind of jump to the next slide because they go hand in hand, which is the references. So to kind of touch on this, traditionally speaking, a lot of organizations do one of two things. They have, well, number one is that they focus very heavily on reference letters. The downside to a reference letter is a couple things. One is that they're very high barrier to write. A reference needs to sit down from scratch on a blank piece of paper and write a full-blown letter. What's going to end up happening is they're going to rush through it because applicants procrastinated. Therefore, the reference was given little time to do it. They are going to go to Chat GPT and they're going to have AI generate a reference that has really no value to you guys. Or what's going to end up happening is that they're going to write about completely different things than other applicants. And so what ends up happening is when you go to review submissions, you're going to be comparing two candidates who on paper are actually both very qualified. One reference was kind of lazy. The other reference has much better writing ability, much better grammar, and they're going to excel. When in theory, that's not the right approach, right? We don't care about the quality of the reference. We care about the themes and the content being submitted. The other thing that often happens is either A, the applicants themselves upload those letters, which is a problem because more times than not, those references should stay private, or in a perfect world, the references send it to you directly. That's ideal, but the downside of that is how they send it. They're either submitting forms to you or they're submitting it to you via email, which means that you have to download them, export them, figure out who they belong to, make sure you didn't lose it along the way, make sure it didn't go to your spam filter, and then you have to reconnect it. You also have very little visibility on which references we're still waiting on. So the proper approach here that I'm going to show you is to kind of do two things. One is that we want to collect references directly from the source. And then number two is that we want to shift away from a reference letter concept and move towards more of a template. So for example, like what are three things you want references to talk about? Instead of saying go write a letter from scratch and incorporate them, treat them more like essays, right? And you prompt them to answer those questions directly. It lowers the barrier for the reference, quality of work goes up, completion rates go up as well. So in this example, what we can actually do is we can jump over to our reference workflow and the applicant can actually put in who the name and email of those references are. Now, right away, this is important because we're tracking this. So we know right away which references are being requested. Eventually, we're going to be able to track the status of those. And so if a reference is being requested but not complete, you can automate reminders to both of them and to the applicants in real time to ensure completion rates. Number two is that we're not waiting on references. So the applicants themselves can kind of continue on through their journey working on their application, letting the references do their thing, and then trusting that the system knows that once the reference is submitted, it'll attach it back to the applicant profile for you guys automatically and trigger status changes. So for example, if you have a program that requires two references, one from, say, for example, a guidance counselor, and then one from like a personal relationship, and you require both of those for a quote unquote complete packet, the system will then trigger those requests to go out. It knows if one or both of them are done. And so if one of those references submits, the system knows, hey, this is not yet a complete profile because we're still waiting on one. And then once that second one comes in, then the system goes, great. Now we have everything that we need. Status has changed, and then the applicant can kind of move on through your pipeline. So ideally what happens here is the applicant puts in who those references are. It then triggers a direct email notification to them. Now, the critical piece to this, and this is where I think other platforms get it wrong, is these emails need to come from you. Nobody knows who Reviewr is. Nobody knows who all the other platforms are. So if this message came from, no reply at reviewr.com, it's going to go to spam and those references are going to delete it. That's a problem. And so in Reviewr, these messages are actually powered by your email domain. So open rates go up, completions go up as well. So reference comes in, they click on link, and then it brings them to a dedicated workspace to actually submit the reference. Now, this example looks a little bit bizarre. This client of ours actually has the references ranking and scoring the applicants opposed to doing letters. That's also completely fine, but does a good job kind of showcasing the major mental shift away from a reference letter for the many reasons I already described. So if it were me, I would say, hey, who are you as a reference? And then maybe three questions. Tell us more about Kyle as a leader. Tell us more about Kyle and his work within the local community. Whatever those essay prompts are. So as a reference, I simply come into a dedicated form. I'm not having to go and, do this in Word documents or offline, then come back and submit it. I just simply come in, I see question, I answer questions, I submit, I move on with my life. Now, the beauty of all this, and I am going to kind of come back to this too, is this all flows into your central command center. So now as an admin, you can see in real time all of your dates and deadlines. You can see recent activity, and then ultimately you can see where each candidate is at within their journey. So on the very front end, you can see who's done, who's not done. You can send reminders. The system will then show you how many outstanding references we're still waiting on, if they're done or not done. Of course, if they're not done, the system will send reminders. And then to kind of to visualize those profiles, what you now get is this menu system of every single applicant who's applying to your program, done or not done. You can sort, you can filter, you can find them. And then when you open an applicant profile, we are centralizing and aggregating all of their information. So in this example, we've got Michael, the candidate. This is all the information that we've collected from he or she in the application form. Their short form content, their transcript letters, whatever it might be. There's a bunch of built-in communication tools. If you are collecting documents, we have a built-in attachment section. So every file that we've ever collected from them shows up: resumes, tax forms, headshots, transcripts. When you press view, those documents, it could be multimedia, it could be PowerPoints, we don't care, actually get embedded in the system. So the idea is that you virtually never need to download or export ever again. We kind of took an old school concept of a binder and we now made it virtual. Better yet is that we can jump over to our references here, which we call supplemental forms. And I am going to come back to that because that is an important piece of this puzzle. If I kind of jump ahead here a couple different slides, and it's going to show you a list of all of those requests. So I know for a fact that I've got one reference request from Steve and then one from Paula. I can track the status of it. And then very similar, when I press view, it actually shows me the reference that in this case, Dwight filled out on behalf of the applicant. And very similar, if it was a letter upload, which you can certainly still do, that file gets embedded directly within Reviewr. So kind of two things. Again, we now have applicants not doing submission forms. We have them creating profiles. Profiles hold on to eligibility. It kind of guides them through the process. Has all of their file uploads in a centralized place. And we now are triggering additional deliverables from third parties, such as references, to speak on their behalf. And then once they do so, it merges it back together. So you got like this concept of a virtual binder that has everything that you might ever need from an applicant, which ultimately unlocks the next piece of today's conversation, which is the review side. So instead of you having to download, export, recompile to share to the review team, what you can instead do is take the profile. If you want to redact information, you certainly can. And then what you're going to do is grant access to the profile to your team and to your committee. And that's where I want to kind of shift our focus to. So on the review and selection side of things, there's a million and one ways that we have clients in our system assigning submissions to teams. At its core, though, very traditionally, many organizations have a dedicated review committee. And they basically say, regardless of the volume of submissions that we receive, you as a committee member are going to review all of them. The downside of that is that we've looked at the data, like I mentioned earlier on, and volunteer fatigue sets in around between 30 to 40 submissions, give or take, depending on the complexity of your forms and of your scorecards. So what does that mean? Number one is that right now volunteers have an hourly average rate of $34.16. Many of us don't correlate time to money, but it is a real metric. And so if your review team is looking at, say, for example, 50, 60, 70 submissions, you are spending roughly $600 to $700 per evaluator just to do the review and time. That's a problem. The bigger problem, however, is that as an evaluator, submissions 30 through 60, even though using a scorecard, are going to be scored on a completely different scale as the first 10 applicants that we looked at. So what does that mean? It means as an applicant, if you're the 33rd person that person reviewed, you're at a complete disadvantage or potentially an advantage, right, over the other applicants. Either by this point in time, the evaluator starts to give out way higher scores or lower scores to rush on, or their tendencies start to drift because now they're comparing each candidate to the first applicants, whereas the first applicants didn't have that ability, right? They had nobody to be compared to. They're just going off of the scorecard. What we also know is that on average, each submission should be reviewed between 3 to 5 times. If an applicant's reviewed less than 3 times, we don't quite have enough information or data about them to be able to quantify the results, right? It's not enough. Anything more than five, however, is a law of diminishing return. When you start to look at the scores and you start to average them out, if somebody is being reviewed 5 times or 25 times, their point margins and their averages really don't deviate too much from the standard deviation. So now that we know this, we can say, okay, great. Let's look at the numbers. Let's figure out how many submissions we have. Let's look at our review team, and let's figure out how we can create review workflows and buckets where each applicant's reviewed between maybe 3 to 5 times, and our team is never looking at maybe more than 35 or 40 submissions. Now, I completely understand there are teams who have, limited capacity and staff time. And so for them, they do have to look at 80, 90, 100 submissions. Unfortunately, that's not ideal, but we have to live with what we're given. And so in that example, it's really important for us to leverage the right technology and tools to keep the team not only hyper efficient, but also maybe start to layer on things like AI, which we're going to come back to. So how do we solve this? In Reviewr, we have a complete feature called workflow building. And this is used a lot of different ways. The goal is to use it multiple ways and layer it on top of each other to get to your numbers. And so it does three things. It'll categorize submissions. It controls progression. It also controls assignments. So what you can consider doing is, hey, if you're a larger group that offers multiple scholarships, you may consider creating buckets for each scholarship. So when an applicant applies to the Lennox Wilder scholarship, they get routed automatically to that grouping. Once they're routed, what you can then do is take your team and start to split them across the different groups. So whenever Sally, Sue, and Steve come in, they're looking at the Jasper Rice scholarships or the Lennox Wilder scholarships. When Cindy, Tony, and Paul come in, they're only looking at the Jasper Rye. So we structured this in a way that we're categorizing our submissions. We're looking at the volume and we're saying, okay, great. We had, 21 submissions in this scholarship. Therefore, we know we need to have, 3 reviewers. Let's assign them out. So when Cindy comes in, she's not seeing 150 submissions. She's only seeing the 32 that are in the Jasper Rye grouping. That's one model. Another model is you could create this as a progression system. So you could have a phase one review, phase two review, final selection. In that model, the task at hand actually changes the math. So in a phase one review, your job is not to get from 150 submissions down to the 5 that you're going to fund. It's to get from 150 to the top 25%. And those top 25% is where the committees come into play. And so in that example, your team can actually review more submissions because you're not comprehensively ranking them. You're looking at, some of the AI summaries, you're looking at some of the eligibility, you're high level kind of doing a thumbs up, thumbs down vetting process. So you can do more than 35. But at that point, once you advance them to round two, when Cindy, Tony, and Paul come in, we're not giving them 150 submissions. We're giving them only the 35 to 40 that, are high quality candidates that we want them to fully score. One other example that I like and I would actually recommend for most of you is you can have the applications get funneled into the system, and then you can open the workflow builders. And what this will actually do is it's going to show you a listing of all of the scholarship applications that you received. It also shows you who from your team in theory could review them. So what you could do is you could say, hey, let's trust Kyle, and I want to have each submission reviewed 5 times, no more, no less. Or you could say, I want my team to be capped at no more than maybe 35 or 40 submissions. You can literally type those numbers in, and then the system will then equally and randomly kind of disperse that across your staff for you to make those numbers match up. There's other models that we can explore. Those are just the ones I want to touch on today. But the idea is once you do this, the system will show you exactly who is paired with whom. And so if there was a conflict of interest or if you want to rework this on a per person basis, you can override it. You can do manual assignments. But the goal here is basically take submissions and get it into the hands of your review team and not doing it in a way that's like, hey, here's all of them. Let's have some logic in place about structure on why we want each person to be reviewing whom they're going to score. Now, the next piece of that puzzle is the review and selection in itself. So I'm going to jump over to another example, which is our upcoming updated interface for judging. This all exists right now within Reviewr. This looks a little bit different if you're a current client of ours. The reason why is I wanted to show you the AI elements as well. To be very clear, all these AI elements live currently in Reviewr. I actually use this though to better showcase all of them at one time, right? Because within Reviewr, most people don't run multiple AI scripts. They run one at a time. So the idea is the reviewer can kind of come in, they can see how many submissions are assigned to them, they can track their progress, they can track the dates and deadlines. And then ultimately, oops, I think I actually pulled the wrong example for us. Let's grab a different example here. 1 second, bear with me, guys. And I apologize, I grabbed the wrong page for us. That's why we do live webinars, right? You guys can watch me make mistakes. Okay, so the idea here is the review team comes in. Again, they can see all the submissions assigned to them, dates and deadlines, progress activity. And then when they go to do scoring, they get a very simple list or menu of the submissions assigned to them. So again, if you have them scoring 80 or 90 submissions, not ideal, but this is where it's really essential to give them online tools to actually conduct the selection. So the review team comes in, they simply click on the name or ID of the entrant that they want to score, they pull the scorecard, and then we give them a split screen. So half the page is a quote unquote submission packet or content we want scored. And then the other half is the scorecard or those rubrics. And so again, if we can shave off 3 to 5 minutes per submission by having a side by side with the built-in scorecards, that in itself is a win. Before we go any further, I do want to jump back to our deck and look at the AI. So again, this is very polarizing. There's so many different ways that we see clients attempting to leverage AI in review. We have different ends of the spectrum. So on the very low hanging end, we have a concept called AI summarization, right? It's a way for you to say, hey, look, we are collecting all this information about the scholars. We've got resumes, we've got transcripts, we've got references, we've got short form content, we've got test scores. It's a lot for a reviewer to read through to score. The question then becomes, at least in an early stage review, do we really need the team reviewing all that information, or could we convert this into like a one-page review brief that kind of calls out the really critical details that need to be scored? So then what happens is that the reviewer comes in, instead of looking at all this overwhelming information, they get a one-page review brief, and that's what they then use to score. And then based off of the results of that, you're going to move people onto phase two, which at that point, the full profiles become visible, transcripts, resumes, you name it, for a much more comprehensive review. But again, you're doing that on a smaller total than all of your applicants. So that's like the most low-hanging way. The other option there would be the most extreme end, which is using AI, loading in your scorecards, loading in your guiding principles, and actually using AI to pre-rank and pre-score your applicants for you. Now, the goal is not to live and die by that, right? The idea is to use that to kind of identify clear consensus of like who the really high quality candidates are and maybe who the very low quality ones are that don't meet your requirements. And then you can leverage that to automatically move people through your pipeline to then inject the human element of judging. So again, two very different ends of the AI spectrum. To help you guys visualize that though, the idea is that your team can actually toggle from the full profile view to the AI view. And again, I did this because I wanted to load in three at the same time to quickly show you. So the three that we typically recommend is Smart Summary. So if you go back and look at this submission form, there's a lot of information. We've got a bunch of essays, short form content. We've got a bunch of file uploads. With the summary view, what it's basically doing is it's pulling forward critical details. And so as an evaluator, instead of getting this comprehensive packet, I'm getting now a picture of the applicant with clear bullet points of metrics and content that you want the review team to score. So instead of having to read through everything and remember it, I just kind of review this, I move on with my life. The model that I prefer the most is the scorecard alignment. So to set the stage on this, AI summarization and those one-page briefs are beneficial. The downside to it is it's a summary. It may not give your review team enough information that they need to properly review them. So what you could instead do is load into the AI prompts your scorecards. So in this example, we've got a scorecard called community benefit. We got a section here called clarity of proposal. The challenge with this is the data that the review team needs for clarity of proposal might live in three different file uploads, two different essays, and then one resume or one reference. So it requires your team to read through all the information, remember what they read, find it, score it, and not forget. So using AI, you could basically say, hey, go audit the applicant profile, find all the data relevant to clarity of proposal, and then pull it forward for us. So it's not summarizing things for you. It's basically just finding data that maps to the scorecard and then bringing it front and center for the review team. So now you have these little buckets that actually go hand to hand with your scorecards. Now, if the evaluator wants to say, hey, let's go read this narrative in deeper detail, they can certainly switch over and view the full version of it. So that is the model that I typically prefer. The last piece of this puzzle then is the pre-rank. So as you can kind of see here, we actually loaded into the prompt these scorecards as well as guiding principles, and then it's leveraging the content submitted by the applicant and your scorecard to actually do what a human would do, right? And rank them and score them on a question by question basis. Again, we have some clients that will say, hey, we're going to trust AI. This is the results. I'm not a huge advocate of that. Instead, what you could do is show the results to the review team and say, hey, do you agree or do you want to change this? That's one option. The other option is to not even use this for scoring. Instead, what you're looking for is to figure out, hey, like when AI did its review, who is the clear consensus to move on to round two? Here's the clear low consensus who shouldn't review. And then what is that gray area in the middle? And that gray area, again, is where humans inject themselves. They manually review them, they manually score them. Some move on, some don't. And then from there, you can take over with a more standard review process, which is the comprehensive profiles like we're looking at here with your scorecards. And so again, the entire idea is to leverage technology and tools to lower the time on the review, but also ensuring that the applicants are getting scored properly to make sure that it's very consistent across your staff. So for the sake of time, the last thing I want to look at is normalization, right? And I'll also touch on the post-selection process as well. So the idea with this is that I made a recommendation earlier that, on average, each submission should be scored, call it 5 times. The downside of that is that that means that your review team is not looking at all the same submissions. I, as Kyle, might get these 10 submissions, but Susie might get a completely different 10. So then the question comes into play, hey, what if Kyle on average scores way lower than Susie? Those 10 submissions that I just reviewed are going to be at a disadvantage because I score way lower or way higher. So in Reviewr, we actually have a built-in report for analyzing results. And the idea behind this is it'll actually kick out a leaderboard and it shows you on an applicant by applicant basis exactly who reviewed them, individual scores and totals. So for example, it says right here that Mark scored Sheldon a 12, but Judge Judy scored it a 31. So right away, my spidey sense is asking, hey, did Mark just score Sheldon very low for a valid reason? Or what if Mark traditionally has never given higher than a 14? By his own standards, he or she just scored Sheldon very, very well. However, Sheldon is being penalized because all these other evaluators scored way higher. So the idea is to now, I'm going to use a report to visualize this, is to use a concept called normalization. And what I want you to focus on here specifically is this green column. And what this is doing is it's showing you on an evaluator by evaluator basis what each of their individual tendencies are. So it says, hey, on average, Paul gives out a score of a 24, Tony gives a 34. So again, going back to my example, any applicant scored by Paul, not Tony, is at an immediate 10-point disadvantage. However, that's not true because Paul's score of 24 and Tony's score of 34 is actually an identical score. It's their own personal average. So you cannot compare the two to one another. What you really want to do, and what this does for you automatically in Reviewr, is instead of comparing Paul to Tony, it actually compares Paul's average to each of the submissions he or she scored. So if I scored, say, Elon here as a 24, it's now a 1, which is average. However, I scored Bruce as a 33. That is almost 15% higher than my own personal average. So it compares the scores against averages and then it normalizes it for you, taking into consideration their tendencies. For any organization that has the review team not reviewing all the candidates and you split the workload, I personally believe that this is an essential piece of data that you have to be looking at because it certainly will move the needle on who the top 10 are, right? Versus doing traditional averages. So with all that said, I am going to pause there. I guess the last thing that we didn't look at was the finish line, which is going to be your post-selection processing. So really briefly, the entire idea is that your programs don't end once you do judging and scoring. You're going to have a series of applicants, right, who you're going to be funding. And so the idea is to then take them out of the review workflow and put them into a new one for ongoing deliverables. Those ongoing deliverables will look different for everybody. It could be very simple. As a scholar, we want you to come back and now give us proof of enrollment, or we want you to accept the terms to the scholarship. Others are way more complex. It could be a renewable scholarship where each year you have to resubmit proof of enrollment, transcripts, etc. Maybe you want to submit like a report in 8 months telling you guys how your scholarship changed their career trajectory, things like that. And so the idea is to not do this offline. What you basically will do, and I'm not going to show this for the sake of time, is you take your scholars, you move them to a new workflow. Those new workflows have all these forms in Reviewr built in: an acceptance form, a proof of enrollment form, a fund disbursement form, an impact report. And then those get assigned to the applicants as quote unquote tasks. So applicants then come into the system, they fill it out in Reviewr. You can track them so you can see in real time who's done it, who hasn't done it. You can automate reminders. Once they've done it, the system then knows, and then your team can review it. What it also does is it aggregates all of it to their profile. So you have an applicant who initially told us who they are, now has who they are, their forms, their files, their eligibility, the judging and scoring, their references, plus all these ongoing deliverables. Since it's all packaged up together, that then gives your team the ability to generate ROI reports and kind of figure out proof of program impact. So again, my goal is to try to keep this at 30 minutes. I know I went quite fast, but again, I wanted to heavy hit you guys with a lot of really key insights. I think if there's one small takeaway that you can apply to your programs, then I would consider today a win. With all that said, I'm going to hang out for as long as you guys want for questions and answers. It can be about any of these 6 topics. It can be about Reviewr. It can be about your programs and maybe other challenges that you're facing. But I will hang out for as long as you guys want to answer any of those questions. Okay, getting pretty quiet. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Again, I really do appreciate all of your time today. Keep an eye out for that follow-up with all these resources, the video, some interactive tours. Feel free to share that with anybody else from your team that you like. Again, if you want to kind of dive deeper and explore Reviewr, I did drop in a link to my personal calendar. We'll love to have those conversations. But again, I really do appreciate all of your time today. Thanks so much.